perspective most of the time, especially when you look at diagnostic criteria of the ICD or the DSM. And very rarely do we move out of that perspective to talk about psychosocial issues that the community, especially in a country like Sri Lanka, would face because of the stigma and the discrimination that exists. So it has a range of psychosocial dynamics like family systems, interpersonal and social environment, and also the biopsychosocial. So we need to talk about the biopsychosocial development of a person from childhood or from birth until where they are at the moment, when they come to you with either gender dysphoria or other concerns related to transsexualism. So if we talk about family system and social environment, we need to consider how, for example, the stigma pervades into the family system, how there is most often non-acceptance from family, even though that is also slightly changing now in Sri Lanka. We also need to consider aspects of violence, because normally we talk about violence from a very gendered perspective of male perpetrating violence on females normally. But we also have to consider the fact that transsexual or transgender individuals and other people belonging to LGBTIQ community would face violence as well from family, plus the broad environment around them. And I must also add that the entire journey of someone who identifies as transsexual to where they are entirely comfortable with their sexual and gender identity is filled with a lot of intense emotions, which we need to consider when we are treating them or when we are assisting them in our clinical work, no matter what it might be. So for me, in a very psychotherapy setting, I would very much focus on the emotional aspect of things while also assisting them with other issues. So it's important because their emotional journey is mainly to look for authenticity. Because until they find that authenticity in front of the public, it's often kind of two selves that they portray. One self which is their real self, and the other self which they show outside because of the lack of acceptance. So we need to consider the emotional journey while on a very balanced perspective we consider the medical and the diagnostic aspect of this as well. So transsexualism, I think around the world, emerges from a very complex web, a complex dynamics of developmental and interpersonal transactions. So again, the people involved in one's family, one's life, it could be school, it could be home, it could be the broader community, right? And interpersonal transactions. And the process of developing one's gender identity, for us, who might consider ourselves to be kind of normative, according to what society or culture expects, can be very complicated for people who are gender variant, because there's a huge kind of a disparity, or you might call it a clash, between cultural expectations, societal expectations, values that we hold as special to us as Sri Lankans, and their own identity. So there's always a clash. Right. So for example, I had a mother who came to see me in my clinic last week about her son. Now, he does not identify himself as transsexual, but he identifies himself as a homosexual. And what the mother told me is, I'm not ready to accept him as my son. Until he changes, he willingly changes. Now what I want to ask you is, ladies and gentlemen, if it was so possible to quickly change things, as and when we wanted to, what if I asked you, can you tomorrow just for kicks, why don't you change your gender and show us if you can do it or not? Or if I ask you, හෙටට විතරක් පොඩ්ඩක් සමසෙනහස් විදියට හැසිරෙන්න කියලා පුළුවන්? Can you? Ask yourself that before we subscribe to the notion, if one really wants to, that they can change their gender identity or sexual identity. Because that's a common conception that exists in our society, especially also amongst health professionals. I'm sorry to say that. That includes all of us, not just doctors. Right? So there is a model that we use to understand how a transsexual person emerges throughout building his or her identity, right? And for us as clinicians or as healthcare professionals, it's important to understand how that shift happens from self-denial, which means denying one's own identity to oneself because of the fear of stigma, and the self-hatred. I think Dr. Prabhasari spoke about this. Hating your own self, hating your genitalia, hating a lot of things about you because that's just not who you are. Two, transitioning to a place of self-acceptance and comfort with yourself, right? But what we need to understand and what I need to make clear to you is that these stages of development is not linear, and not everyone goes through them the same way. So if you look at how the stages happen in a linear order, but this can change from person to person, right? Awareness, so that's when one builds or realizes that I'm different. Very simply put, I'm different. That can happen as early as a small child attending preschool or a child attending primary school. Or sometimes it even happens after puberty, it depends, right? And this is a stage where a lot of gender variant people or people who identify as transsexual may have or face a lot of distress, psychologically, and sometimes physically also, right? So as clinicians, because I have also kind of included what we as clinicians can do to make this process a little more comfortable for people we work with, right? So it's up to us to normalize those experiences and tell them it's okay to feel not so comfortable with yourself at this stage. It is not a mental illness per se that to feel bad at that time. It is not something that can be diagnosed, right? But it's a feeling of very, very severe discomfort with oneself. And hence why I also said at the start, we need to think from a holistic approach, including the psychosocial and the psychological aspect as well, because distress cannot always be pathologized. So the next step, seeking information. This is where people want to seek information, gain education about what it is like to be a transsexual, what is it like in society, is it accepted, not accepted, etc. How do you live as a transsexual person? So as people working in the healthcare sector, can promote for them to reach out to relevant organizations, relevant people, relevant doctors who work in the field to gather that information for themselves. But remember that people who come to you or come to us might not always just come to gather information, but it's also because they want to feel heard. They want their story to be heard fully, not just what we are looking for in a diagnostic perspective. Disclosure to significant others. So telling family, coming out or emerging your identity, coming out and saying, look, I'm different, this is what I feel, this is what I want to be, right? And it can be very disturbing also for the family and the spouses and children and etc. of people. We need to consider that angle as well when we are working in this field, right? So what we can also do is to help the family and to support the person to integrate into the family system, which is, I must admit, not easy to do, but it's always good for us to strive towards that. Exploration of your identity and self-labeling. So self-labeling in the sense, having something to identify myself with. Am I a transsexual? Am I an androgynous person? Etc. Because that also gives people a certain sense of stability and comfort. To have something that they can hold on to identify themselves. So we also need to support them to articulate that identity, to speak about it, and also to reflect together with our service users, to reflect together on what that identity means to them as human beings, and in a broader context where their family and community and society is involved. Finally, exploration of transition issues and body modification, or let's say sex reassignment surgery. So exploring options. How can it be done? Where can it be done? What will I look like afterwards? What would happen afterwards? What kind of feelings would I have? So all of those things are things that we need to also discuss in our kind of interactions with people from the transsexual community. And we also need to act as advocates, it's very important. Not just a clinical role, but we also need to act as advocates where we also stand up for rights. Because ultimately, we as a country, we have struggled, we have a long journey of struggling with basic human rights. Not just for the LGBTIQA community, but for everyone. So I think we also have that responsibility to stand up when we know that rights are being violated, and to be advocates, not because they are lesser than us, but it's because they are just as human as we are. And finally, integration. That means acceptance of the identity, the new identity, and transition, post-transition issues. So after surgery, after completing or after kind of going through a period of hormone therapy, how do you synthesize that identity for them to again reintegrate back into their community and society? Right? So this is just a framework for us to think from. It is not set in stone, but it's something that can guide us in our practice, no matter what field we come from. There may be surgeons here, there may be gynecologists, there may be psychiatrists, there are endocrinologists, so many different people that you can be involved in supporting someone who's transsexual. So, ideally, in my personal experience and also working with the community for a period of time, what I've come to realize is that service users want things out of us as clinicians. And one main thing is for us to be aware of their invisibility in society. Because if we are aware of their invisibility, we also are aware of how societal context plays a role in their overall health and well-being. Emergence as a continuous process. So, having said that, it's important for us to understand that it's not, someone just doesn't realize he or she is transgender or transsexual and be ready for transitioning in a week's time. It doesn't happen like that. It's a period of time. It's a process. It has ups and downs. There are ambiguities involved. So we need to navigate all of that with our service users. It's very important. To be there in that journey with them, not in front of them, not behind them, but to walk with them in that journey. And I think the effects of transphobia and the impact of violence on people. I think we know countless stories. I'm sure the next speaker after me would also enlighten you on the countless stories of harassment, violence that people in the community face. So we need to be aware of that. Because sometimes we talk about mental health problems associated with being transsexual, but those mental health problems, like Dr. Kandy correctly said, is not always because of their gender identity, it's because of broader societal problems. Fluidity of gender identity, we spoke about this in the earlier presentation. We have to understand that not everyone and not everyone is going to stay the exact same the whole time. So you might find someone in your clinic, in a month later they might tell you, I feel a little different than what I told you when I met you 1 month ago. It can happen. So we need to be accepting of that. And in our work with service users, there are times where gender and sexuality is not relevant to what we are doing with them. So to not just look at them from a lens of their gender identity or sexual identity, but to look at them as an overall human being who has other identities as well. It is not just those two identities. We have a lot of other identities. And I like this analogy where the clinician acts as a midwife. Now I'm sure all of you know who is a midwife, right? We act as a midwife in our work with people who may be transsexual or transgender because we witness their birthing in our consultation rooms. Where we assist, we encourage, we support, but ideally we bear witness to their birthing. They're coming out, they're emerging, right? So we play two roles, one of a support role and one of bearing witness. And I think that's a very powerful movement for us as people who work in the healthcare professions to witness that birthing. And the birthing is over a period of time. It is not like what you see in the labor room. So it's important for us to understand that. Okay, I'm going to go over some simple guidelines to follow as good practice and not so good practice for us as people in the healthcare profession. So when we are working with transsexual people or we might interact with transsexual people, pronouns become very important when we are addressing them. Now, when I say pronouns, normally we use what? He or she, or him or her. But in the case of working with transsexual people, we might have to go beyond him and her, right? So the respectable thing to do as people in the field is to ask your client or service user, how would you like to be addressed? Simple as that. Without kind of subscribing to various assumptions that we have in our head based on how they look, what they're wearing, how they speak, etc. Because none of that is fact sometimes. It can be just our opinion based on our biases. So ask. So usually we use pronouns like they and them when we're talking about transsexual people or transgender individuals or people who are not gender conforming. They or them. Now in singular it doesn't become much of an issue because we can just use a gender neutral term, but in English sometimes it becomes an issue. So it's always important to ask, right? Use non-judgmental language and avoid labeling. Now, I know personally there are so many medical professionals around the country who I have heard the story from that sometimes when people come who are transsexual, it's all in your head, right? So things like that, it's important that we avoid. And respect the service user's position concerning their gender identity. They might not fit entirely into diagnostic criteria all the time, but it's important to respect that, right? And to become familiar with the cultural and social background that service users come from. Some guidelines that we should avoid, things we should avoid. Automatically attribute all service users' problems to their gender identity. No, some problems are beyond that, right? Fail to recognize that as much as society and stigma has an impact on how one may feel, they may also have their own negative attitudes and ideas about being different. We call that internalized transphobia, where you internalize the external stigma that you receive to make it about yourself. Right? So we need to acknowledge that, and also we need to acknowledge that we cannot pressure anyone into coming out. Right? And to be insensitive and ignorant to the nature and diversity of gender relations, variant relationships. Right, final 2 slides. So challenges we as clinicians would face when we are working with people who are transsexual. One is acknowledging and valuing different relationships. So not the relationships we are told is right or wrong from our childhood. Not relationships that conform to the gender binary of male and female, but other relationships. Respecting fluidity, we spoke about this, and taking an affirmative stance with different sexual practices that we may encounter when working with people who are gender variant or have other sexual orientations. And we have our own stereotypes, not as doctors or psychologists or psychiatrists, but as human beings, we have our own stereotypes and prejudices that we have developed from childhood, which we need to question and acknowledge. And we've also faced loss, grief, stigma, and prejudice in our lives in different ways that we also need to acknowledge, because sometimes our own experiences hinder us providing proper services to our service users. So common concerns of people who might come to us as a general thing, issues related to coming out, that means expressing your identity to someone else, or being outed against their will, that means without their consent, telling people about their identity, which may put them in a lot of distress and trouble. Familial pressure to change and convert, we have this a lot in Sri Lanka, right? Discrimination, I don't have to tell you this. Intimate partner violence. Now this is another very important thing, because we believe that only in heterosexual and heteronormative relationships that you find domestic violence or intimate partner violence happening. But we also need to acknowledge that in transsexual relationships or other relationships that are different, there is intimate partner violence and domestic violence that we need to take into consideration. Mental health problems, doctor spoke about, I'm not going to touch on that. Suicide and self-harming behavior we might find. Sexual concerns of different nature, right, which we need to address, and violence, rape, and harassment. which people in the community face way more than we think they do, because it doesn't get reported in the media, it doesn't get reported to the police sometimes, and people suffer in silence, like you very rightly said at the start. Right? So we need to consider all of this when we're looking at transsexualism from a psychosocial point of view. And what I would also like to say is, just please try to be open to this and to look at it from a broader perspective than what we are used to looking. Okay? So having said that, thank you so much once again for listening, and thank you for the opportunity to the KSM. I really am honored to be here once again. Thank you.